This single camera shot represents gaming's inherent flaw, a solved problem that's been abandoned by the greedy ghouls up top. Movies are made of scenes with multiple shots. Each is carefully curated by a cinematographer. Every movie or show you've watched has them. They're one of the 3 heads of production needed to make what gets cut into chunks for TikTok. Video games have directors, with some reaching auteur status where people buy just because of their connection. Video games have producers, often working as a bridge for the publisher, with some reaching a different kind of legendary status. But video games don't have traditional cinematographers. The director of photography role is instead absorbed by the larger development team, with some in charge of gameplay cameras and others for cutscenes, but they're often programmers, not filmmakers. This single shot from the small indie film, The Shining, uses multiple composition tricks. It's symmetrical down the center, with leading lines pointing towards the twins, directing the audience's attention, with a high angle over Danny's head, separating us from the character but still giving his perspective. Its color and patterns separate our 3 players from each other in the background. And if we really stretch that, you could even relate Danny's red palette to the exit sign or the fire alarm representing his desire to leave. Or maybe he wants to burn the hotel down. This single shot represents gaming's inherent flaw. You, the player. Without cameras, video games would be nothing but audio. That works for some but can't for most. Cameras give perspective. At the beginning, only 2, top-down and side view. As graphic fidelity advanced, perspectives grew with it. We gained first person and third person. These 4 perspectives define the medium, all still being used and innovated within to this day. First with the power of depth, which also created the isometric view, something reminiscent of a diorama or a god looking in on their lifeforms ready to delete the latter. Video game adjacent media often ignores the history of arcades and PC, instead focusing on the consoles as if gaming didn't exist before the NES, all because of a silly little crash. Even though both before and during the bulk of the console wars, they were ever present and, for a long time, thriving. When people speak about third-person games, there's 2 kings they focus on: Super Mario 64 and Resident Evil 4. The latter for the over-the-shoulder style, but we're gonna save that for later. We're still talking the early 90s here. The jeans under skirts era can wait. And Super Mario 64 often gets praised for creating the third-person perspective we know today and getting players accustomed with the help of Ocarina of Time. No one talks about Space Harrier in 1985 or the countless racing and flight sims that used the third-person perspectives, such as Nintendo's own Mario Kart in 1992. I'm not saying Mario 64 and the N64 as a whole don't deserve praise because of those. It's an excellent platformer, and the console is the first foray into gaming for many, including my own with Ocarina of Time. But it deserves praise for the right things. In any medium, the best camera is one you don't notice, because if you do, it ruins their purpose: to immerse you into a scene so the filmmakers can convey the feelings they're emulating, with some wiggle room because art is subjective. Different techniques do this in different ways. A high angle portrays the subjects as less than, while a low angle does the opposite. If any of the techniques are noticed, you're no longer enjoying the film, you're enjoying the shots, or even worse, hating them. This required ignorance causes this topic to rarely get attention, and so video games rarely get praised for their clever camera work, which is why Mario is the focus for so many. The first character you see isn't Mario, but Lakitu, the Koopa you're controlling alongside Mario. The ignorance rule is broken. You're immediately made aware of the camera, so you notice it as you play.
Yo, listen up.
We will not live in a 2-dimensional world.
We won't go in one direction
Or seek where we can say.
We will walk through walls. We will take a look around us.
we will not be confined.
But it's me, Mario!
Yeah, tell it to the judge.
This is the selling point of the console, so they wanted it to be obvious. 3 dimensions means new perspectives. What people don't seem to get is, Super Mario 64 doesn't just use a third-person camera. Just like the scrolling 2D view from Mario's past, it's dynamic. In other games, your view would be locked into the position behind you. But Lakitu moves around corners and backs away from Mario to give you more visibility. This was a solution for the limitations of the hardware. One analog stick on the controller's penis meant the camera could only be adjusted by button presses. We'll have to put a pin in Mario for a moment, because what we've been ignoring doesn't just take control of the camera like Mario's 64th Superman cosplay, but never gives it up. While there was a lot of variety in art direction in 1983, it was all still pixel art. Dragon's Lair broke the mold and showed that there were more options, but fidelity came at a cost. Dragon's Lair is a hand-drawn game designed by Don Bluth, the creator of countless classics that you've surely seen or heard of. This art style caused the gameplay to be a series of QuickTime events, so not much of a game and more of an interactive cutscene. Still, by far the peak of graphics for the time. Later, hand-drawn art would flourish into many of the greatest indies out there like Hollow Knight or Cuphead, but back then, limitations in hardware and development cycles made gameplay take a backseat for pretty art. A choice that is still made today, with Hellblade 2 being as beautifully realistic as a game can be, but not necessarily fun or intuitive to play. Other games, ones that are much more definitively video games, were inspired by Dragon's Lair to raise the bar for art style, making beautiful hand-drawn scenes more common, but in formats that better fit the medium. Another side effect of Dragon's Lair's art style is the use of film techniques. I mean, it's basically a film in a cabinet, which means this might count as the first use of fixed camera angles. After and during this time, some point-and-clicks would dabble with the use of interesting angles, playing with depth to create interesting scenes, but because the sprites are 2D, the use of interesting angles were limited. Even when real actors were used, as the use of a different angle would require a completely different player character to showcase that angle, so more than one or two wasn't super common. It took until 3D games for camera angles to be explored, but for a long time this was an incredibly expensive expectation for arcades to achieve. And so the dimension was a rarity until roughly 1992. Sega was releasing the Virtua series, most notably Virtua Racing, the predecessor to and Virtua Fighter, the first fully 3D fighting game. On home systems, PC games like Wolfenstein 3D were hitting the shelves. Wolfenstein 3D was a first-person shooter that allowed you to move in a 3D space to shoot 2D Nazis. These 2D sprites give the same problem point-and-clicks did. You can only view them at one or two angles with a variable depth, so it's not really fully 3D, just kinda has 3D features. But then there's Alone in the Dark.
The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown.
While this might look a little silly today, and we have countless examples of modern creatures that are much more terrifying, back then people like
The Assassin, 1792,
were used to 2D since there were very few 3D games on the market. They didn't know what this was. So this ghoul could have done anything. The imagination was free to expand on what they were looking at. That is the entire concept of fixed camera angles. Let me explain. Alone in the Dark is made of 3D models inside of a 3D space, which was too intense for the computers of the time, hence why Wolfenstein steered toward 2D, so instead the backgrounds were pre-rendered to allow for computers to have extra power for the 3D models, allowing all elements to be more detailed than they would have been otherwise. They modeled the background, took a picture, and then put it into the play space. Anything you could pick up or change was then modeled and put into the same space, including the enemies and Edward Carnby themselves. Big RPGs like Final Fantasy VII used this style because of this raised fidelity. Similar processes were used for Donkey Kong Country and Mortal Kombat, so the feature wasn't completely untapped ground, but these are both in a 2D space and this is in a 3D, so it's a little different. This new 3D technique came with a massive downside. This setting can only exist in this exact position. You can't move the camera because you're standing on a big JPEG. But limitation feeds innovation, and so fixed camera angles were born. Resident Evil, Grim Fandango, or
Eliza
would then take this perspective and innovate even further, attempting to realize its true potential. A potential that we may never see. In my video about pacing, oh look, a link, I speak a lot on developer control, how they can never truly tell a narrative because you control the momentum of the story they've written, and so the story and gameplay become separate entities and ludonarrative dissonance is frequent. A lot of this is caused by the camera. You, the player, choose what the focus is, but Fixed takes that away. By allowing the developer to decide the angles at all times, film techniques can then be used during gameplay instead of just cutscenes, such as angling toward an open door only for a monster to roam in. With 3D sprites and backgrounds, angles can take that further, like a low angle to show the scale of something. A video by Game Maker's Toolkit is one of the sources I use to research this topic. He speaks on a moment from Resident Evil 2 that I already wanted to bring up before watching, but he explains the scene so flawlessly that instead of plagiarizing his work, I'm simply going to play you the segment and steal his work more directly. Take it away, Mark!
The first camera is placed here and uses the leading lines of these two walls to draw our eye to the window, where a mysterious creature skitters past. In the next scene, the camera is now from the perspective of whatever was outside the window, making Leon look like delicious prey. Then, a high angle to make Leon look small and vulnerable, and a scene where Leon must run towards the camera and then around a blind corner, meaning the player can't see whatever threat is in front of them. Then, the camera frames a broken window and a decapitated zombie, again obscuring the player's view of what's ahead. And then a shot that perfectly frames this bloody puddle, dripping ceiling tile, and broken window. I wouldn't blame you if you ever so slowly tiptoed up to the edge of the screen. That's just good horror right there.
What a beautiful sounding man. Anyways, in the remake of Resident Evil 2, they didn't use fixed, instead switching to third person. So the liquor reveal is a lot more sudden, with a lot less tease. While the perspective isn't exclusive to horror, it is a natural fit. Tension is a large part of horror and fixed cameras support that. They play into the unknown. You rarely get a full look at what you're up against, even if they're right in front of you, and can be creatively placed to further lean into the mystery by hiding oncoming enemies. This focus on hidden threats causes you to become a lot more aware of what you can see, since that is a limited quantity, which is easier to do because everything is static and in turn easier to consume. This raised awareness also ties to audio, which can hint towards things you can't see, like this. This is more common in this perspective than any other. There's an extra advantage, but to explain I have to come clean. So far I've been treating the cinematographer as king, but the truth is, it's not a one-person job. The role is tightly knit with production design, location scouting, lighting, costuming, and more. The director of photography role can only work with the tools they're given, and by teaming up with these other people, we get these legendary shots of storytelling. Development doesn't work like film because these things can be changed at any time. You're not locked into how a hallway looks until launch. The separate roles still exist, but they're a lot more tight-knit and flexible, sometimes with one person wearing many hats, allowing true creative expression. This perspective isn't flawless either. The cuts can be sudden and jolting. A struggle to reposition yourself in an unnatural environment can add to the horror, but most of the time it adds to the difficulty of controls, which is why the genre has become synonymous with tank controls. But they get a lot of hate, and by proxy, fixed angles do as well. Frankly, they just take some time to get used to. Skill issue. But the Resident Evil remake shows that the system can work without them, and later, Silent Hill did the same thing. Fixed cameras do not equal tank controls. Speaking of Silent Hill, it's a marker of huge advancement with this tech. Silent Hill had fully 3D backgrounds as well, unlike those that came before, which allowed for the camera to move with the character at set times. Remember, this is the same style used by Super Mario 64, but in a vastly different way. Keep that pin in a while longer. The camera stays behind or chases the character at certain points. If you're exploring the town, it follows. If you enter an enclosed space, it locks. This style added to the vibe of Silent Hill and the sequels, making some of the best set pieces in all of gaming, and engraving themselves in history. The cinematic nature of these fixed angles drew more than just horror into its maw. Ico has since become one of the most influential works ever made, forging the way for how devs would write character relationships and telling one of the best stories games have ever had, that would unfortunately be overshadowed by its sequel, Ico tells a story through the environment, one that feels real and heavily steeped in symbolism. But the camera's role would eventually be forgotten and left behind by those Ico influenced. Dark Souls and Elden Ring are directly inspired by Ico and Berserk, and while they still feature big wide vistas to introduce new areas, the camera doesn't move to introduce them, not to mention its lacking performance during bigger bosses. This is a common trend. Fixed was left behind. Even at the very beginning with Alone in the Dark, the juggernaut that was Wolfenstein 3D shined a lot brighter, and history repeated itself to put the final nail in the fixed camera angle's coffin. id Software's Wolfenstein and Doom tag teamed to create what is today known as the first-person shooter, with Quake later advancing the medium into multiplayer in 1996. After these two established the format of 3D levels, many first-person shooters would follow, all being labeled Doom clones. Beyond being able to shoot guns good, first person has a huge advantage over every other perspective type: immersion. It puts you into the head of the player character, so you're not playing as V, you are V. This allows you to get up close and personal with the world, looking at all the little details. From the development side, this perspective might be the best option, but for cinematography and cameras in general, this might be the worst. Third person allows you to add character. You can show emotion and intention through their actions with the camera stressing that. It can show Lara's face as she turns around to show you how she's feeling in that situation, and zoom in on her real close to create this cramped feeling to simulate the claustrophobia she's experiencing in that moment. A zoom out with a wide angle can show the entirety of a horizon or area. To a lesser degree, a character can put out their hands to feel the reeds as you walk or against a wall. These little things make us care more about the character we're playing, so sure, we feel less like them, there's a detachment, but that detachment allows for storytelling that makes us care about the character more than we ever could in first person. Now maybe that's a conversation for my therapist. Why I believe that embodying the character makes me care about them less than if I'm not. Maybe I need to love myself more. But I truly believe this isn't personal and everybody feels this way to a degree. Right? Right? Character development in first person isn't impossible, my favorite being Henry's tower grab in Firewatch, and there is a flip side to this negative. This lack of character animation makes this perspective by far the easiest to develop for in the 3D space, aka infinitely cheaper. So it dominates the store shelves and the indie platforms. And yet, narratively, it is by far the weakest of the options. But that's what cutscenes are for, right? Right? I don't know what this video is about. There may already be hundreds of comments about this by people who didn't watch to this point. Cutscenes will often take the camera away and treat your experience more like a movie, as will dialogue in some cases. Others will stick with first person for the dialogue and cutscenes, which results in dialogue feeling stiff and boring and cutscenes hitting nowhere near the potential they could. Hardcore Henry is a legendary film, but not for its story. I digress. Metal Gear Solid 1 is pretty legendary for its movie quality cutscenes, often credited for bringing cinema-level storytelling into the space, but it also did this during gameplay through the use of fixed camera angles. Many forget this, and by Metal Gear Solid 4, so did Kojima, so instead you get to see Grandpa Snake's juicy ass up close and personal. I just want to acknowledge, I know cutscenes exist. I know film techniques are used in cutscenes all the time. And while I appreciate those that tell cinematic stories for hours, I'm choosing to play a video game, not watch a movie. But these same techniques don't need to be exclusive to cutscenes. We already proved that with fixed camera angles. But I truly believe this goes beyond them. The gaming industry didn't just forget about fixed camera angles, they forgot cameras. So they've instead been using cinematics as a crutch, and it all started with a single game. Resident Evil 4, 2005, uses third person like many of the games we've spoken about so far, but it drags into Leon's shoulder, creating the over-the-shoulder subgenre of third person. This viewpoint keeps you tight with the action and the horror, making you feel more connected to Leon while keeping the animation boons that first person lacks. Also allows you to aim guns good, which is great. It innovated on the concept in a creative way to form the genre into something similar, but new. The problem doesn't really come from Resident Evil, but the shockwave after. This zone would later be used for nearly every narrative-focused AAA game after. Don't get me wrong, there are exceptions, but this is definitely the bulk, especially out of PlayStation. Resident Evil 4's release is an important point in gaming. It's incredibly innovative for the Resident Evil franchise and horror as a whole, but it's also the end of creativity and innovation for big budget video games. And because perspective is tied to the advancement of video games, a true representation of creative expression, Resident Evil 4 marks the end of a 4-decade-long run of experimentation. Worst of all, Resident Evil 4 was also the demise of what made the franchise so fantastic to begin with: fixed camera angles. Not because it didn't use them, but because of the message the game's reception sent to Capcom. After Resident Evil 4, the series never returned to the format. Resident Evil Requiem, or 9, is meant to be honoring the franchise and what made them great, calling ode to locations and characters from the previous entries, and so it uses two perspectives, third and first, the two perspectives used throughout the prior games. But at least in marketing, not fixed. This is true for all of survival horror and gaming as a whole. Fixed cameras were left in the past, forgotten and abandoned. Even though it's a proven method, fixed angles are now viewed as a risk, and games cost so much and take so long to release, there's no room for risk. Failure can mark the end of the entire studio, and has. After we all got addicted to Animal Crossing for a while and could finally go outside again, gaming became a mature market, meaning it's no longer growing in revenue or population, but instead stagnating or declining. You could blame the Bo Burnham's Inside years for this, but it isn't the direct cause because gaming has since declined in numbers beyond what it reached pre-2020. This lack of growth has caused investors to look elsewhere, namely towards generative AI, which is why you see so many tech studios focusing their marketing on it, even though the bulk of the user base either doesn't care or doesn't want it. Lack of investors means less money means less innovation, and less innovation means less investors. Just an endless cycle of decline until something breaks free, but again, that's risky. This causes hesitancy towards creative and wacky ideas and further homogenization. This weirdly includes remakes. Developers are choosing to move away from the perspective that made the original unique, instead embracing the third-person over-the-shoulder perspective. Even though they claim different reasons for the decision to embrace this model, the real reason is marketability. It's simply easier to sell the recently proven over-the-shoulder than convincing people why fixed is still cool, and how tank controls aren't involved. Instead of embracing where they came from, and innovating on the perspective and making fixed cameras a possibility again, they shun and turn away. Regardless of quality, this is the worst thing that can happen to a remake, because they didn't remake the game, they reimagined it and called it a remake, meaning we'll never see what these could truly be in a modern day. When creativity has been abandoned, cinematic camera work is the first to go, because the best cameras are ones that players or watchers don't notice. And yet, the ignorance of video game cameras will be the beginning of gaming's downfall. Luckily, the path towards renewal is already paved and the savior's walking it. You.
Hello, my name is Pancake. I have been providing the balloons. I want to tell you about Drew's Patreon, but I have to go quick. The worms are really bad to tie nuts. For only $1 every month at patreon.com/DrewSunn, you gain behind-the-scenes access with sneak peeks to future videos, an appearance at the end of videos like
Big Chunk
is showing off, a chance to be shouted out in the video, early access to content, usually the shorts tied to videos, but you will receive this video a whole month before it released on YouTube, and much more, with new benefits being added when we come up with them. Supporting at patreon.com/DrewSunn, 2 N's, no spaces, allows these videos to exist, as we have started bringing on employees like CB Doodles, who makes the art for the thumbnail.
What the hey, man?
I really wanted to do the ad read for the Patreon.
Well, you could've just asked.
But this was funnier.
Our monkey brains are weird. They work a lot more like a dog learning to speak than a complex supercomputer pumping out world-changing algorithms. If we're not receiving a constant influx of rewards, then we don't feel as happy with the experience we're having. The game feels aimless and lackluster. Video games become a constant flow of rewards to combat this. The more common the reward, the less important it becomes. In short, the reward outshines the journey. What we did doesn't matter as much as what we got. Now you might be thinking, what the heck does this have to do with cameras? To answer that question, let's look toward the aptly named Journey. In 2012, after we discovered the world wasn't ending, that game company released Journey. It's about climbing a mountain, and most of the rewards help you achieve that goal by extending your stamina scarf to allow you to float for longer periods. a tool you don't need to reach the credits, but it's nice to have. But these little scarf extension pills aren't what players remember about Journey. Instead, they remember the beautiful award-winning music, the stunning art style and lighting, the movement that accentuates it all, but none of that would matter if the developer didn't steal and recontextualize the camera controls from Super Mario 64. We can remove that pin now. Here's a mushroom to get you going. Journey takes what Lakitu did and brings it to modern day. And while Journey isn't the first to take inspiration from Mario's camera, Journey makes it a core feature. Like Mario, Silent Hill, and Ico, Journey uses a dynamic camera. Let's define that. In film, dynamic camera movement is basically any time the camera moves. Duh. With that logic, nearly every modern game has a dynamic camera, right? Well, in film, because the audience only sees what the filmmakers want them to see, movement is used to enhance the purpose of a shot. A neutral panning shot follows the action, a slow pan raises anticipation, a whip pan raises intensity, and that's all just one type of movement. A push-in shows emphasis, a push-out does the opposite. There are zooms, rolls, tracking, the list goes on, each with its own purpose, emulating a distinct feeling for the audience. In gaming, a dynamic camera is when the developer sees control to better fit their intention, be that narratively or to help you play. A very common example of this is simply increasing the FOV as your speed increases to make it look faster. In Super Mario 64, dynamic was used to look around corners. Silent Hill, dynamic was to follow Harry and add tension. Ico, dynamic was to show the incredible architecture and art. In Journey, a dynamic camera is used for everything I just said and more. Except for following Harry, I guess. It will sway and zoom out over hills to give a better look at the environment, zoom in during cramped moments, and generally move in directions without player control to better fit the current platform. The three dynamic cameras I focused on were all using the format to solve a problem. The controller only has one stick, well, except for Ico, which released on the PS2, but it was designed originally for the PS1. But like, the PS1 also had, we'll count it, shut up. Journey doesn't have that limitation, and so control is never taken away from the player entirely. At any time, you can move the stick, ruining their plan, but allowing
Ace Angel 73
to play how they want. Journey is incredibly influential. It won many awards and was nominated for a Grammy, the first game to ever do so. It inspired many similar emotional indies to follow, some by the studio Giant Squid, which is composed of members from that game company who didn't want to work on Sky Children of Light for the rest of their career, so instead they made Abzu Hawk's Pro Journey. Those Journey-inspired have become some of the best that gaming has to offer, at least in my opinion. And yet, once again, its most important tool gets ignored to speak on different aspects. Seeming familiar? I've been speaking about fixed camera angles as if they're extinct, but that's not necessarily true. I lied for dramatic effect. They still exist, just not in the format that they used to be or at the level of praise. Point and clicks have gone through a lot of evolution throughout history. Originally titled adventure games, based on the text-based Colossal Cave Adventure, but that genre, thanks largely to The Legend of Zelda, has completely lost meaning with time, with everything claiming to be an adventure game. So, it was renamed to point and clicks, and with 3D games like Grim Fandango, they embraced fixed angles. Again, we could debate if they were present in 2D, but like, Eventually, after many years of popularity, the industry moved away from what point and click was, and so it's kind of experienced a near death. Rarely explored even by indies, but it does of course still have an audience that's clutching tightly to it. Instead, the genre's influence lives on in many narrative-focused games, especially of the cinematic variety, like those made by Telltale, Quantic Dream, Don't Nod, Deck 9, or Supermassive.
Pop, pop, peanut butter, butter pops. Pop, pop, pop them in your mouth. Pop.
They lean so far into the cinematic style that I've been calling them choose-your-own-adventure movies. Like the old books where you could like morph the story by going to different page numbers based on your decisions, with different endings depending on what you do. Or in Telltale's case, roughly the same ending regardless of what you do. These are dialogue-centric, with very little gameplay outside of the choices. Sometimes quick-time events like Dragon's Lair or exploration segments. I bring these up because they're still using fixed angles since they're mimicking film. But just like the cinematics we talked about earlier, in my mind, they don't really count, or, you know, at the very least, they don't add to the conversation meaningfully. They are, for the most part, playable movies with walking sim breaks. They're glorified cutscenes inside of a box, or I guess download page now. Let me be clear. I love these games and their glorified cutscenes. I'm a big fan of Sia, and I'm very excited for Wolf Among Us 2. If it's still real. In the more gameplay-centric genre that it started in, survival horror, they still exist as well, but with a catch. Eliza, the medium, Heartworm,
and Tormented Souls
are keeping the genre alive, but rather than using fixed angles to expand and innovate with them, they're using them to play off nostalgia. They're playing ode to the classics rather than becoming their own thing. Now, keep in mind, my nostalgia is what they're playing off. I love these games and the PSX art style. I'm not saying they're not innovating at all, but their aim is clearly to pay homage. Art is not without intention. In short, I don't think a game needs to look like this to use the technology we created 2 decades ago. Back then we understood that, and some really showed off how fixed cameras could be featured in unique ways without feeling the need to be Resident Evil. But they got overlooked, and so what they did was forgotten. I mean, hell, even Resident Evil did the same with Sweet Home. Sorry, I shouldn't assume that you know things. Let me explain. In 1996, Resident Evil released to critical acclaim as a spiritual successor to 1989's Sweet Home, with Takuro Fujiwara handing creative control to Shinji Mikami due to him not being very good with horror and the belief that you have to be scared to make something scary. It was then followed up with Resident Evil 2 in 1998 and Resident Evil 3 in 1999. Mikami felt the series wasn't doing enough to be different from its origins, so he directed Resident Evil 4 and made something new, but leaned into action rather than horror, possibly because he wasn't as scared after a decade of working with mostly horror games. Before he killed the perspective, these 3 were so popular, especially the first, that they caused many to mimic their features. Capcom themselves did so many times, most of which originally being planned to have connections to Resident Evil, but having that scrapped from their narrative during development. But outside of Capcom, many studios were attracted to the style as well, such as Parasite Eve by Square Enix or Kuon by From Software. Many have become legendary, unforgettable titles that still hold a lot of weight to this day, but many others have been forgotten with time, even though they innovated more on the perspective than Capcom ever did. There are loads of games that didn't change the fixed camera perspective meaningfully, but still have moments of creative framing and angles that deserve praise in their own right. There's near limitless potential, but I would rather focus on a few that evolved the perspective, like how real cameras transferred from film to digital, and now nearly everything is digital for better or worse. I need your help a little here. Name your favorite game that used fixed angles in the comments and either describe how it evolved the fixed camera genre, or describe it just a cool moment where the camera was used in a way that you think of fondly. Moving on. In 2004, Forbidden Siren mostly used a slightly nauseating third-person perspective, but became fixed to show important items, a concept later used in Sia, and first-person to show the monster's perspective. This mesh of perspectives is really interesting despite seeming pretty rough. A year later, Cold Fear did similar with greater success. It remained in a fixed state for most of the game, but if you aimed your gun, the view swapped to third person, allowing enemies to be faster than they commonly are in Resident Evil. Fatal Frame did the same thing, but with first person to mimic a real camera, launching a series all using this concept, at least until they announced a remake of Fatal Frame 2 that uses fucking third person instead of fixed camera angles! Something I left out earlier because I love making you wait. In Metal Gear Solid, you could look around walls by leaning against them and aim in first person, effectively using every 3D camera type we've spoken about at some point. Why are they alone on this? Side view, top view, isometric, third person, first person, fixed angles, and dynamic. We use these labels to define the experience, a secondary genre to tack onto a primary genre, but all of them are just one thing: a camera. These games show what modern perspectives could be, but refuse to be. It's a pattern. Fixed being the first refusal, then dynamic with Journey, and now? Without cameras, video games would be nothing but audio. So what are video games if not cameras? Gaming has become a mature market. This is a phrase usually tied to economics. Gaming is no longer growing in revenue or popularity, and so it's matured and will now start dying. Like most of the people watching this, you're aging right now. But I think that's a good thing. Gamers have also become mature. with many above their 30s who haven't stopped playing since the 90s. Many of the concepts this video has covered, we've lived through. And so you inherently know how to control most video games because you've played dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands. Most teach these things through a tutorial, but you don't really need most of what they teach anymore. I'm gonna throw you a curveball. Over 20 years ago, in 2002, the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man released. Soon after, Iron Man hit theaters in 2008. Since then, countless superhero films have been released with countless topics being explored, like space and aliens, politics and civil rights, but not too much, gotta hit those ratings, and lastly, time travel in the multiverse, which became a trend. Many films took their shot at the multiverse, to a degree that I became fatigued at the concept regardless of how many amazing films came out of the topic. In fact, for many, the same thing happened with superheroes in general. The genre has been explored to death in the last 2 decades, and so now people hunger for something new, but James Gunn,
I'm Jimmy Gunn,
disagrees.
I don't believe in superhero fatigue. I think there's, mediocre movie fatigue.
After he said this, he then released the best Superman film there's ever been, and one of the best superhero movies in my opinion. The thing is, I truly don't believe this movie would have been possible 2 decades ago. Superman moves at such a fast pace with complex topics that most people would have left the theater confused. It took 20 years of movies to educate the general audience in order for this film to be possible. Arguably 40 due to the original Superman in 1978, which was also incredible, but I'm not gonna push it. If that's what 20 years of superheroes can do, I don't see why the same can't be true for 60 years of video games. In 2017, Platinum Games released the third-person hack-and-slash title Nier Automata, a sequel to the 2010 Nier, later re-released as Nier Replicant version 1.2247448713 ... in 2021. All of which a spin-off of one of the 5 endings from the first Drakengard released in 2003. Now I'm sure all of that sounds a little crazy, which is fitting because Nier isn't just a third-person hack-and-slash. It becomes 2 types of bullet hells, a fighting game, a 2D brawler, a top-down game, it uses fixed angles, and probably more that I don't remember or know. Films use camera angles and set dressing to enhance the mood. They're devices subliminally telling the audience how to feel. Video games use cameras to tell the player how to act. It's an interactive medium, so how the perspective moves or how the stage is set drastically changes how we play and, by extension, how we feel. Nier, and to a lesser extent some of the other games mentioned, have mastered this aspect of game design, as did Arkham Asylum in 2009. Video games should be allowed to change perspective genres to better fit the story being told, or better fit the expectations of the player. If a 2D angle makes more sense, use it. We already did this decades ago with fixed camera angles, but they were abandoned by most of the industry, leaving individuals like Yoko Taro or John Nesky as lone beacons in an ocean of mediocrity. The ignorance of video game cameras will be the beginning of gaming's downfall. And maybe it's time for gaming to die. The best camera in any medium is one unnoticed. This is a common belief spouted by film cinematographers. By paying attention to cinematography, you immediately ruin the cinematographer's goal. You're no longer being leaned towards feeling their intent. You're no longer consuming the experience, instead paying attention to a single part of it. While cameras shouldn't be an afterthought for developers, they're a huge part of the process that needs more attention, it should be an afterthought for the players. A feature to be reflected upon after playing or during replay. On a first playthrough, we should take it all in, embracing the experience that's been built for us. But the ballooning of the industry's budget, alongside other factors, has caused a lack of innovation for all AAA studios across the board. On one hand, this is a horrible thing. Publishers are incentivized against exploring intriguing ideas. Less revenue flow means publishing fewer games, which hurts indies. We are in an era where there are more releases than ever, in an environment where so many get overlooked and passed by. On the other hand, this is an amazing thing. By removing these money-grubby ghouls from the industry, the art remains. The creativity is present. The creator just needs something to get started. This is where you come in. Indies have consistently innovated in this space with interesting and risky concepts that are sometimes crazy, like shaking a rat, and other times revolutionary, like the entire precision platformer genre. By supporting indie developers with creative ideas, we are telling the industry that trying something different can work. Indie showcases can give you an idea of what to play. Shout out to the Wholesome Direct, 6-1 Indie, and the Day of the Devs. But if you want an indie that plays with perspective, I'd recommend Subway Midnight. It's a short horror game set on a train with segments dedicated to different storylines and horror themes, all with distinct art styles and sometimes different perspectives. Instead of fighting for change as I've pushed in some of my other videos, I'm instead asking you to back down. Not just in the fight for better camera work, I want you to back down to the developers themselves, regardless if that's an indie dev or a AAA studio. Trust their vision, trust what they're delivering to you, and dive in. Allow them to have control over the situation rather than fighting against it. Enjoy the little moments, stew in them, and breathe. I know this can be hard sometimes, especially during stressful sections like platforming challenges or boss fights, but it isn't impossible. This video right here can help you with those stressful moments, so if you'd like to further improve your time, click right here. Thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed the little moments of this video. I love you. Mwah!